All right, welcome back. How's everyone? Good. Good weekend? Yeah. People like some football this weekend? What's this for?
Because overcame 21-point deficit.
Who's we?
Baylor.
Oh, you're Baylor. Anyone else having fun? See, Texas? No? When's that due? When's that due? November? That's like in 3 weeks.
Yeah, and I got all kinds of
All right, okay, everyone, shh. Settle down, My voice is a little bit less strong than usual, so I'll try to speak up, but I'll do my best. All right, so let's see. Okay, so good news. We are halfway done through the semester. This is class 15. I don't know if you keep track, but I do. We are 50% of the way through. So it always creeps up on you because a future interest topic is so difficult. It feels like it goes on forever, and it just ends. Like from my perspective, the organized perpetuity is like a bookend, right? So the first half of the semester is done, and I'll admit after this it gets easier, right? The hardest part of the semester is actually already over. I not deliberate, but the hardest part of the semester is actually over. So it does get a little bit easier after this. Still some hard topics, but not nearly as difficult as a future interest. Okay. But the downside to that is don't forget about future interest because you will need to know that at the end of the semester. So if you haven't already, take a look at the exams from last year. There are some questions which are all about future interest. Take a look at it. Try to answer the ones you know. If you have never heard of something, don't answer it. Did anybody go to the Langdell yet? Good? You find that useful? Okay, good. Go to that. Langdell, she's very good. Yeah, she's a very good instructor. She's done this before. She did very well in my class, and I think you'll learn a lot. Okay? Yes?
In relation to Langdell, did we say there was one thing she covered where it sets a years of time, and we were thinking you detail? And then did you say hold off on that?
We're not doing details.
Okay,
yeah.
That's what.
Yeah, it's in a book. You might want to know, but I'm not going to test you on it. And I don't even think I mentioned it in class more than 2 minutes. Okay. All right. Any other questions, things in your mind about the exam, about the Langdell, about future interest, about the rule against perpetuities? Anything on your mind? No? Okay. All right. So the topic today isn't difficult, but you might get confused if you look at it too quickly. We're focusing on co-ownership. So the entire time we were discussing property, we always thought in terms of a present interest and a future interest, right? A owns it today, and then when A died, B gets it. And when B dies, B's heirs gets it, whatever it happens to be. So we have this idea that a given piece of land may have multiple owners at the present time and the future time. So it shouldn't surprise you that you can also have a piece of land with multiple owners at the same time, right? This is what we call concurrent interests. The same way that A might own a property today and then B owns it at some point in the future, A and B may also own it today, together. And our goal for today is to discuss 3 different types of concurrent interests, right? So we have the tenancy, we have tenants in common, we have joint tenants, we have tenancy by the entirety. And get these names down very clearly. You're going to be tempted to say joint tenants in common. I promise you. Someone today or next class will say joint tenants in common. That is not a thing, right? That's like called a possible reversion. That's also not a thing, okay? So don't say it, right? Don't say joint tenants in common. These are 3 separate estates with 3 separate rules. And don't like abbreviate in your notes. Don't write like JT or TIC. Write it out until you get it. And when you get it, you can actually start abbreviating. But for now, indulge yourself by actually writing the full words out. Raise your hand. Okay. All right. These are the 3 concurrent interests we'll study. And what separates them, okay, is what happens upon death of one of the tenants. Okay. The biggest difference between these 2 is how land transfers after death. Okay. They all, though, bear one thing in common, and this is probably the trickiest part of the entire topic. When you have 2 people who own land concurrently, they have what's called an undivided interest. Okay? What does that mean, an undivided interest? The same way that if any of you have roommates, you may have your bedroom, he may have his bedroom, you may have a common room. And maybe you have some rules amongst the two of you that says, okay, I'll stay in my bedroom, you stay in your bedroom, and then we split the TV room, right? You maybe reach that agreement. What happens if your roommate comes into your room? You might throw him out and get out of my room, this is my place. Okay? With concurrent interests, you can't do that. Each of the tenants with concurrent interests has access to the entirety of the land, right? When you are concurrent interests, you have access to all of the land in the property. You cannot exclude your tenant from anywhere in the property. In fact, if you try to exclude someone, you can actually sever the tenancy, and you can actually get in trouble. You can get sued. We'll see that more in the next class. Okay. The other aspect of this undivided interest is that you don't say that you own a share of it, right? So say, and we'll do this in a minute, but say that A and B are as tenants in common, right? If I ask you what's A's interests and what is B's interests, someone in this room, and I promise will be urged to tell me, oh yeah, A owns 50% and B owns 50%, right? That's the wrong answer. They do not have percentages, okay? Don't tell me that A has 50% and B has 50%, okay? They each have what's called a separate but undivided interest. We'll go back to this in a few minutes, but I want to get these preliminary things out of the way. Okay? Don't tell me they each own 50%, or if there are three of them, they each own a third. They own it together. All of it. And they each have a separate but undivided interest. What makes this conceptually difficult is even though I'm saying they own it together, they can transfer their shares to someone else. Right? So here's the disconnect. When they're owning it together, they each collectively own 100%, but it's not 50-50. Yet, if one of them sells a share to someone else, he's effectively selling half of the half of the estate to someone else. But we do not say he has a 50% share. He's selling his own separate but undivided interest. We're going to get that much. If you get these 2 points, right, that each has a separate but undivided interest, and with that separate but undivided interest, they can access the entirety of the property, you'll be okay. Those are the 2 hardest points for this topic. After that, it's actually a couple things you have to memorize. All right, everyone else okay with that? Okay, so let's start off by focusing on the tenants in common. Now, sometimes called tenants in common, sometimes called tenancy in common, the same thing. All right, where did I finish last time? You want to refresh your memory? I think I called Cassandra. I think I called you. All right, I'll just start with all right, I think I did Cassandra, so I'll start with all right, Jacqueline. Did I call you last time? Okay, so you're up. I knew it was somewhere in that ballpark. All right, so what is a tenant in common? What does that mean?
It means that A and B have co-ownership of property.
Be more precise. You're right, but be more precise. What exactly does it mean to be tenants in common?
They both have equal and undivided access to concurrent property.
Okay, I'll take that for a start, okay? That's on the right track, right? That's partially right. So the most simple type of concurrent interest we have is called a tenants in common, okay? And rather than giving you one definition, I'll give you different characteristics of the tenants in common. So the first one, right? Okay, it looks like this. T divides his Blackacre to A and B, okay? This is what the granting language looks like. And I'll spare you. I'm not going to make a table because we don't need to. These are a lot easier. But in theory, if you want, you could add this to your table from last week. But I would not recommend it. These are much easier, right? It says T divides Blacker to A and B. And I'll put in parentheses as tenants in common. This is probably how I would write an exam, right? When T gives it to Blackacre as A and B as tenants in common, he's giving them a tenancy in common, right? There's no random things you have to memorize. It's actually spelled out, okay? So as tenants in common, one of the characteristics they have is that A and B have what's called a separate undivided interest in the land. And again, what does that mean? Collectively, they own Blackacre in 100%, right? In theory, you can say they own it together in fee simple, right? But they each have a separate interest in the land. No one person owns it in fee simple by himself. Each A and B has a separate interest. But with that separate undivided interest, they have access to the entirety of Blackacre. A can't build a fence and lock it and block off B from coming onto part of the land. B can't block off A from coming to part of the land. Each have access to the entirety of the property. Okay? Everyone get that? All right. Ashley, is A or B allowed to sell, her share in the land?
To sell it? I know it's
Can they? Don't get to death yet.
okay.
You're jumping ahead. I'm doing this on purpose. Can A or B sell their share in the land with the tenants in common? This isn't hard. This is right in the reading. This is not hard. I don't know why you're guessing. What do you think, Allison?
Yes, because they can give it to whoever they want. And that
Yes.
person has interest in it.
Yes, right? So here's the rub. With concurrent interests, you can always sell your share, right? You can always sell your share. The only important fact is, by selling your share, you may transform the nature of your estate. And this will make more sense when we do the joint tenancy in a minute, right? But there's no law against you selling your interest in a piece of land. If you have a concurrent interest and you hate your co-tenant and you want to get the hell out of there, you can sell your share, right? So the tenants in common, right? Can share. They're allowed to. There's no law that says you can't sell your own share in tenancy in common, right? So, Brian, let's ask this question. So you have A and B, they're tenants in common, right? A is pissed off at B, doesn't like it anymore. So A sells his share to C. What's the relationship then between B and C?
B and C are now they're tenants in common. They both have a concurrent ownership.
Yes, right? So it's the example, right? A sells share to C. We then said B and C are tenants in common. Effectively, C steps into the place of B. The relationship remains exactly the same, right? So they're still tenants in common. All right. Eric, how could these parties possibly dissolve this tenancy in common and make it owned by one person? What would have to happen?
They can sell the interest to the other party.
Yes, right, exactly. So what happens if, different example, C sells a share to B? Then what happens, Eric? Exactly. Everyone see that? They are always going to be tenants in common unless one person possesses both shares. If one person has both shares, both tenancies in common, they come together, and there's fee simple. Everyone get that? Is it a hand anywhere? Okay. All right. So with tenants in common, you're always able to sell your share. That's never a problem. Okay. One of the other aspects of tenancy in common is what happens on the death of one of the members, one of the tenants. So again, pretend it's just A and B. Pretend these examples didn't happen yet. Christian, let's say that A dies, and his heir is C, right? What happens after A dies?
His share goes to C.
Yeah. Exactly, right? With the tenants in common, the interest passes on to the heir of the tenant. So if A dies and his heir is C, then B and C are tenants in common. Right? So the idea of a tenants in common is these two people aren't very closely related, right? When A dies, it goes to his heirs, and now B has a new roommate. B now is stuck with C as a tenant in common. I want to see that. Yeah.
So we're talking about fee simple, but could you have joint or like tenants in common or even joint tenants for I guess life estate?
Sure. Yes, we'll do that. We'll do that in a few minutes.
Okay.
We'll do an example like that like in 10 or 15 minutes. All right. Catherine, let me ask you this question. What happens if instead of A having one heir, he has two heirs, C and D? What happens then? Go with your gut.
They both have an equal portion
Yes.
of A.
Right. Say A has two children, C and D, they're both his heirs. Then they would share A's interest. Right? Catherine, what happens if there are 10 heirs?
They each have a tenth of
Yeah.
is it A?
Yeah.
A.
I had a student who sat right there last year, and he had a situation where his grandmother, whatever, or great grandmother died without a will, and there was a co-tenancy, and the grandma had, as a co-tenant, she had 37 heirs. So you had all 37 heirs were fighting over this land, which by the way had a lot of oil on it, somewhere in the hills, right? And they were fighting over this land with 37 heirs. They could not agree to a damn thing. Could not agree to a thing. So this actually happens not frequently, but when people die without wills and they don't designate who their heirs are, the intestacy statute kicks in. And you have all these children and grandchildren and great-grandkids and nieces and nephews all taking a percentage of this share.
A situation like that is just a simple majority makes the decision.
No. Everyone has their each individual share, right? I say separate but undivided interest. Each interest separate. So unless you get all 37 to relinquish their share as a whole, then you can't get rid of them. They're still co-tenants, and they get to share in any royalties from the minerals or whatever that's on the land.
Does that mean that you 10 co-tenants all have the same share?
Yeah, well, it's a little complicated based on the intestacy statute. So like kids might get more than grandkids, but basically, yes.
But like in this situation,
Yeah.
A and B.
Yes. Yeah, they each have the same share. And it gets really messy. What if one of those people dies and doesn't have a will, and their 5 kids now take their share? You can see how this goes on and on. It gets to be really, you chop something into a lot of different pieces, right? All right. This is actually a very ripe area for fraud, where a lot of times you find these really old people, and you find some sort of huckster, some sort of scam artist who finds a way to get into their will with a very small share of a piece of land. And if they have that small share, they can frustrate an entire deal. They go off and then buy out the entire family. They just need that one little share to get in there. And this is a very dangerous area for fraud on old people who don't really know what they got. All right, any questions on the tenancy in common? Okay. And again, I don't want you to tell me at any point, I know someone will, that A and B have a 50-50 share. If I ask you, what is A's interest? I want you to tell me He has a separate but undivided interest in Blackacre. That's what I want you to tell me. Don't give me 50-50. Someone will say it, I promise. Maybe next class, but someone will say that. All right? Yes, sir.
I think you probably explained and I missed it. So A has 2 heirs.
Yeah.
A and B have it. A has 2 heirs. Do they now, he dies, you have C and D. Do C and D have 50% of his 50%, or do they all have a third?
Don't give me 50%. You just exactly said, okay, so I'll do the example again, right?
So
Yeah, let me, okay, so A dies, and his heirs are C and D, right? Right? So then, that's the example, right? That's the one I gave him a minute ago, right? So then B, right? I'll do it like this. C and D are tenants in common. The reason I put this in parentheses is because effectively C and D are splitting A's former share, right? So C and D are now sharing A's former share. But this is not about 50%, 25-25. That's not what this is. There's a serious temptation to do that, but I want you to fight it, resist it.
Can you say that they own an undivided one?
No. Don't say that. Just don't say that. See, I told you. It took like 30 seconds, right? Yeah.
I'm not sure. Are they're not equal, they're less than B?
Well, C and D are equal because they're sharing the interest they got from A.
So like if a court ordered them to sell it, they couldn't.
Okay, so here's where the numbers actually do matter, right? And that's the example you gave. Say a court ordered a sale, and the lot sold for $100,000, right? B would get 50, C and D would each get 25. The only time these numbers, I was going to get to this in a minute, but the only time these numbers make sense is if a partition sale is ordered. At that point, then you start saying, okay, $100,000 lot, okay, B gets 50,000, C gets 25, D gets 25. But that's the only time when you break it down to numbers. So at that point, the tenancy has been severed. You don't have a tenancy anymore. Now you have an interest in land, profit.
So that's a partition sales order, but what if they just sell it on their own? Can they try to enforce that?
If they sell it on their own, they can divide it however they want.
Okay.
I mean, they can go to court and have an order, but they could divide it however they wanted.
Okay.
See, I weren't. Yeah, go ahead.
Does it work the same for the oil royalties then?
Pretty much, yeah. You can be co-tenants for subsurface rights, so you can divide your minerals up like that, and then you could have your arrangement where you're getting half minerals, but each party doesn't own half the land. That's what I don't want you saying, right? Whatever profits might come from it, that's fine. You can divide that however you want. But for ownership of the land, it's not 50-50. It's not 50, 25, 25. Fight the urge. Don't say it. I know you want to. The only time when you're allowed to say this is if there's some sort of mineral or you're selling it or something else. Then you can divide up in cash. Yeah.
So when C and D both have access to the entirety of the land?
Yes, sir. Yeah, even if you're a co-tenant with, something of a reduced share, you still can access the entirety of the property.
So you can only say 50%, like if you're talking about the cash and how you're gonna split it, not necessarily like.
That's after a sale.
Okay.
After a sale, you can do it like that.
Okay, yeah.
Right, and we'll get to partitions in a minute, but those are greatly disfavored, and you'll see this in the case law. Courts don't like ordering sales of land. Courts don't like ordering sales because if you're a co-tenant, you agreed to be a co-tenant. You entered that. You didn't have to accept it. You could have declined it. It's like making a bad deal with a roommate for life. If you have a roommate, you might have him for at least for a year or whatever. But if you have a roommate, if you're a co-tenant, it's effectively forever until he dies or transfers his interest. So be very careful about co-tenancies. Other questions? Okay, let's go on to the second type. I know it seems simple, right? But it gets confusing conceptually. So today there's very few pages of reading. Okay. So second, we're going to do joint tenants. So I want you to think about the different tenancies as kind of like a pyramid, right? Each new one we do has different rights and different benefits for the landholders. Okay, so John. Okay, so Eddie, what's the main difference between the joint tenancy and the tenancy in common? It's the main difference.
I think the main difference would be between what happens after the individual, what happens after either A or B dies.
Exactly right. Okay. So again, so I'll do it like this. So I say from O to A and B as joint tenants. Okay. So O is giving blanket A and B as joint tenants. In the previous example we did with the tenancy in common, when either A or B died, the land went to their heirs. So when A died, it went to A's heirs. When B died, it went to B's heirs. The joint tenants is designed to make sure that there's a right of survivorship. And the book uses this phrase without really defining it, which I'll do it now for you. The right of survivorship means that one joint tenant inherits from the other, right? This is what Eddie said. So when A dies, B inherits A's interest, right? And Jason, what happens when A dies and B inherits A's interest? What happens when one person has both interests in a piece of land? Right, they start off as joint tenants. A dies, then B inherits A's interest. What happens to B now? What interest does B have? What do we call that?
Feasible.
Exactly right. BSV simple. So it starts off, right? We said that A and B have a separate but undivided interest in the land. Okay. A dies. Through the right of survivorship, B inherit A's interest. So now BSV simple. Why? B has his interest and A's interest. There's merger. When one person has both interests in a piece of land, merges together, BSV simple. Let's see that. This is why the right of survivorship is very powerful. Okay. I've said this a few times before, but wills are a fairly recent invention, right? For most of the last 300-400 years, people didn't have wills. So if you had a husband and wife living together, or you had two brothers living together, and they wanted to make sure that when one of them died, the land would automatically go to the other one, right? It wouldn't have to go through probate. It wouldn't have to go to court. There would not be lengthy proceedings. The way this estate operates is the second one of them dies, his interest immediately transfers to the other joint tenant. And then B owns in fee simple.
Is it a good idea to think of it in that way of like A's interest transferring to B instead of A's interest just no longer exists?
No.
And now B
Think of it the way I said it, right? A's interest actually transfers to B.
So what's wrong with thinking of it the other way? Where,
How did you say the second one?
so A's interest is no longer in existence. So B is the sole.
Well, where did it go?
It just
Did-
disappeared. Just
No,
like him.
why? No, it doesn't vanish. No. Interest and property never vanish.
Okay.
Interest and property never vanish. They have to go somewhere. Interests in land have to go somewhere. Someone has to hold it. So A held it while he's alive. When A died, it descends or goes to B through this right of survivorship. Everyone see that?
Okay, because can I read you something from the book?
No.
Okay.
That's okay.
It says exactly what I just said.
Do it the way I said. Okay. All right. So everyone okay with that? All right. Think of it that A's interest transferred to B upon death. Okay. All right. Now, the trick about the joint tenancy is that it actually supersedes a will, right? Say, for example, again, that A's heir is C, and A writes a will and says, all my property when I die goes to C. Sonia, does that make any difference that A wrote a will and left all of his land to C? How come?
proposed, then it goes to the other person who has the joint. So basically, it's the joint tenancy supersedes the will.
Exactly. Exactly. Right? The issue with a joint tenancy, right? You cannot convey by will. A joint tenant cannot convey their interest by will. When they die, before the will even gets probated, immediately it goes to the other joint tenant. Everyone okay with that so far? Okay. But, Elizabeth, what about an inter vivos transfer? That is, can A convey to C during A's life?
I'd say yes.
Well, remember I said before, you're always allowed to transfer your interest during life. They can't stop you, right? So the answer to the question is yes, right? Right, so A to C, or A transfers his interest to C, right? That's fine. There's no problem with that. But here comes the tricky part, Elizabeth. What happens if A transfers his interest to C? You gotta be louder.
Would you repeat that?
What happens when A transfers his interest to C? What's then the relation between B and C? No. Okay, let me explain this part. The issue with the joint tenancy is based on this idea of unities, right? And I'll do the unities in a second. But generally speaking, whenever a transfer is made by a joint tenant that breaks apart these unities, it demolishes, it destroys the joint tenancy. And I'll explain this in a second, but effectively what happens when A transfers interest to C, it severs the joint tenancy. And think of like chutes and ladders, right? You go down the ladder. B and C are now tenants in common. So think of it like a pyramid, right? At the bottom, you have the tenancy in common. Then you have the joint tenancy. Then you have the tenancy by the entirety, which we'll do in a couple minutes. If you break apart a joint tenancy, you go right down the ladder, and then you go back to a tenancy in common. And you ask Josh, what's the big deal? Well, by doing this, you eliminate the right of survivorship. The most valuable aspect of a joint tenancy is its right of survivorship, right? You know that if you happen to win the ultimate game of chance and outlive your joint tenant, the land is yours. But if you only have a tenancy in common and the other person dies, you now have a new neighbor instead of having it be simple, right? Okay, everyone okay with this? So let's go over this. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Just a quick question.
Go ahead, take your time.
While they can't pass it on in death or anything like that, but they can sell it during their life. And that, in fact, is what breaks and makes it go to common.
And I'll explain the break in a second. That's right. So let's go through this idea of these four unities, right? And these are not actually too hard to memorize because it's a nice mnemonic device. T-tip. Okay. In order to create joint tenancy, you need to have these four unities. Okay. Ava, you want to just go through what these four unities are, please? Just list them. Very good. Thank you. Okay. And the way I remember it, and you will remember it, every law student for the last 100 years to remember it, is T-tip. This is actually a fairly easy acronym to remember, but if you remember this, you'll know. Oops. I have to put an extra line there. Okay. The goal of T-tip in these four unities is that these are truly joint tenants, and they're joint in every sense of the word, right? They acquire the land at the same time. Okay. They acquired it through the same instrument, through the same title, right? They have an equal interest in the land, and they have equal possession in the land, right? All these things must be present at all times, right? They have to have acquired at the same time, first one, Second one is have to acquire with same instrument. And when I say instrument, I mean piece of paper, right? The same legal document through which title is acquired, a deed, if you will. Okay, you'll learn more about deeds next semester. Okay. And each must have an equal, undivided share. Okay. And again, this is not 50-50. Don't ask for the 50-50%. They each have access to the entire property, but they have a separate interest they retain for themselves that perhaps they can sell or do whatever they wish with. Okay. And possession, which is very similar to interest, but not exactly the same, is have equal right to possession of the whole, meaning one tenant can't, build a fence and exclude the other tenant from the other part of the property. All right, everyone okay with that? What's important to remember at the joint tenancy is that all four of these must be present at all times. They must be present when you form the joint tenancy, and they must be present throughout the entire duration of the joint tenancy. If any of these is ever severed, if any of these unities ever broken, immediately the joint tenancy falls apart. And like Chutes and Ladders, it breaks down to a tenancy in common. Okay? So let's try a few examples. So Juan, what happens if you're a joint tenant, right? And your other tenant puts up a fence, blocks you off. You can't get to most of the property. What is now your relationship between the two of you?
I'll say a tenancy in common.
Yes, that's right. Tom, explain why. What unity was severed there?
I think it was possession.
Exactly right. If you are a joint tenant with someone else, you need to have access to the entirety of the land. If your joint tenant puts up a fence, right, he might think he's really cool blocking you off, but he just destroyed your joint tenancy. You now go down the ladder, and you now have a tenancy in common. And this was a way to punish him, right? So you want a joint tenancy, right? Your neighbor wants a joint tenancy because he has the survivorship right. But by being a jerk and fencing you up, he's now lost his interest, right? And now Juan's able to sell his land to someone else without any consequences, right? So there's a serious cost to severing these unities, right? An easy example, James. What happens if you? Oh, yeah, go ahead, please.
If you ever do that for something that you love that fence, I know you don't want to mention about 50%, but his portion of land is still considered like 100% for him.
Yes.
When he sells it to him.
It doesn't matter where he puts up the fence. He puts up just a 1 foot plot over here, or he fences 80% of it. It doesn't even matter. All right, James. What happens if you're a joint tenant and you decide to sell your share to someone else? What happens then? Interview this.
The person you just sold your share to is in common.
That's exactly right. Which unity do you sever when you sell your land? Or sell your interest in the land, I should say. Or unities. And time also, right? If you sell your plot of land, right, you violate this one because you now didn't acquire at the same time. There are different people who acquire at different times. Different instrument. You now have two different instruments transferring it. Not really interest possession, but definitely the first two you violate, right? So the easiest way to end a joint tenancy is when one party sells his interest to a third party. And again, you don't always want to do this because then you lose your right of survivorship. And it's mutually reinforcing. Both of them want to keep that right of survivorship. So the second, once one of them messes up, he loses it, and the other one loses as well. So you have an interest to play nice with your neighbors. Questions on this?
The tenants in common, they're supposed to have full access though as well, correct?
Same. Doesn't matter what kind of tenant you are, you have access to the entirety of the property. Right? The difference is, let me ask you, Eric, what happens for your tenants in common and your neighbor puts up a fence? Your tenant puts up a fence. What's the consequence of that?
I don't know.
Okay.
Assuming you have access still.
Well, no, and the fence is locked. You can't get through. So the answer is you're still tenants in common, But you can actually go to a court and get an order to remove the fence because you are tenants in common. Right? The major consequence with the joint tenancy is if a fence is put up, you've severed it. Right? If you're already a tenant in common, there's nothing to sever. You're at the bottom of the ladder. But you can still get a court order. In some cases, you can actually get ordered to pay rent. Because say he's blocking up a piece of land using for business, you actually get proceeds from that. So there are different possible remedies for you. If you can't agree with your co-tenant, one of the most common remedies, which courts don't like, is called partition by sale, where they will either A, partition it and actually break it into half, or B, they'll put the entire lot up for a sale, and then you can split the proceeds, right? Courts don't like doing either of these because you say you became a co-tenant by choice, right? You didn't have to accept this arrangement, but you accepted it, and now you're stuck with it. I wouldn't do that. Questions on this?
That last part about petitioning.
Right. Courts say you had a choice of becoming a joint tenant. You had a choice of being a co-tenant. You accepted those terms. This is your roommate. Deal with it. Think back to like college when you have like a roommate problem. RA says deal with it, guys. Right? It's basically that. Don't bother with this. With this, you know, these squabbles. Figure it out yourselves. Mm-hmm. All right. Other questions on the joint tenancy? All right. The last one we'll study is what's called the tenancy by the entirety. And we will return to this at some length in a couple weeks when we do marital property. Okay? We'll do this a lot more length, so we'll just mention it today. But the tenancy by the entirety is between married people, okay? What's interesting is when I taught this last year, the answer was husband and wife. But the answer today is actually spouses. So there have actually been a number of states that have actually revised their tenancy by the entirety laws to reflect same-sex couples. So I think Maryland's done a few others. So effectively, it's only for married couples. But the other side is most states don't even have these anymore, and we'll explain this why later. But generally, the tenancy by the entirety is the joint tenancy plus a fifth unity with his marriage. That's the main difference. The tenancy by the entirety is just like, the tenancy by the entirety is just like the joint tenancy with a fifth unity, which is marriage. Okay? And as you may imagine, the way to sever that fifth unity is to end the marriage, which is what we call divorce. Okay? But same as before, one of the spouses perhaps can sell his or her interest. Okay? And when you sever one interest, you become tenants in common. Okay? So when an interest is severed, a tenancy in common. I know you want to say, oh, it becomes, like a joint tenancy, but yeah, I think it shoots and ladders, right? You go all the way down. So when you sever, everyone know shoots and ladders? Everyone know the game I'm talking about? Okay, good. If you don't, we'll come play after class, okay? When you have a tenancy by the entirety and one of the interests is severed, it shoots down all the way to a tenancy in common. This exists in roughly half the states. Texas has it kind of, but not really. We'll talk more about that like in a couple weeks when we do marital property. Yeah.
But one spouse can't sell their interest without permission of the other.
So this is one of the rubs, right? You effectively need the other spouse's consent to transfer her interest. And again, this is why I want to do this more, discuss marital property, because this varies. Because in a number of jurisdictions, it's considered quite paternalistic to give one spouse to check on the other spouse's former property, right? But she's correct. One spouse can usually defeat the conveyance by the other.
But attempting to sell it without the permission, first of all, you're not gonna get anywhere. But then does that attempt drop you down
What-
to joint tenants?
No, I mean, but if the sale actually, so let me put it this way, right? If you actually sell it, and the court upholds the sale, then the unity's severed, right? If for whatever reason under the law of the state you need the permission of the other spouse, the sale is void and the unities remain. But I want to hold off on this. We're going to do an entire topic on marital property, and there are a lot of really complicated rules to this. That's all I want to say about this now, okay? Everyone okay with that? All right, let's do some questions on page 346, please. All right, let's take a look at question number 1. I think we're up to Andrew.
Okay, very black iron to
A lot louder, please. I should say. Okay. All right, thank you. So we have a situation where we have A, B, and C as joint tenants, right? I do not want you to tell me that A, B, and C each own a third of Blackacre. Do not tell me that, okay? They are joint tenants, and each has a separate but undivided interest in Blackacre together, okay? So what makes this question difficult is we have to conceptualize each relationship separately. So let me walk you through like this, right? Andrew, what's the relation between A and B? No, what's the key word there that's in that grant? So what's the relation between A and B? Good. What's the relation between B and C? What's the relation between A and C? That's right. Each is a separate relationship. There actually are 3 separate relationships, right? Between A and B, B and C, and A and C. Remember when you were in high school and you had those like problems like if there are 3 people in the room, they each shake each other's hands, how many handshakes are there? Remember you have questions like that? Which you should, right? Think of each one as a separate joint tenancy. And the reason why I have to do this is because if one of these guys severs, if one of these guys severs his relationship, the others remain, right? So what makes this question hard is just because A conveys his interest to D, that doesn't affect relations between B and C, right? So let's write this out. Oops, what did I do? Okay, let's write this out. So we have A and B, B and C. Look at this. Right? We have these 3 relationships between A and B, A and C, and B and C. And you correctly said this is joint, right? This is joint, and this is joint. All right, everyone get me so far? All right, so Philip, what happens when A transfers his interest to D?
They go down to tenants.
Which is they? Be very precise.
A's relationship to B and A's relationship.
That's right. So what happens? This is severed, and this is severed, right? Philip, why is it severed? You're correct, but why is it severed? Which unity was violated?
The 3 unities, the time, possession.
Well, just 4. T-tip, right? TTIP.
Yeah.
Which of the 4 unities were violated?
Time, title, and possession.
Time, title, and interest, right? Possession's only violated if you physically build a wall. That's the only time you'll have the possession violated. No wall was built here, right? So it's severed because you violated TTI, and if I write that, you know what it means, the time, the title, and the interest, right? So what happens after it's severed? Now, you say that D, or actually let me ask it like this. Americ, how would we then describe the relationship between D and B? What's their relationship?
They should still have, since it hasn't been served,
No. Between D and B.
they should have joint tenants, right?
A transfers interest to D, right? What's then the relation between D and B?
Oh, so they can have a common.
Yes.
It's just, okay.
So the relation between D and B is common. It's tenancy common. Everyone see that? Initially, the relation between A and B was joint tenancy, right? Initially, there was a joint tenancy between A and B. Okay? But now, I'll put this on one line. That now, after that was severed, D and B are now tenants in common. Rachel, I want to take a look. Now, what's relations between A and C? How would we describe that? I'm sorry, between D and C. Sorry. You're right. Between D and C.
So would they be tenants in common?
That's right. Why, that's correct. Why are they tenants in common?
Well, I mean, he can't come in and be a joint interest.
But with who? With
C.
exactly right. But now, Jordan, did anything happen to the relation between B and C?
No.
Nothing happened in the relation between B and C. What are B and C's relationship here?
Are they still joint?
They're still, B and C are still, I'll put this in caps, right? Joint tenants. You have this weird situation, right? B and C as to each other are joint tenants, but D to B are tenants in common, and D to C are tenants in common. So within one piece of land with three people, you have different sets of relationships. This is how I want you to think about it. You think of each relationship separately from the others. Otherwise, this case won't make sense. They might not all have the same relationships. That's my next question. That's me the rest of the question. We'll get there in a second. Any question on this so far? Any questions on this? All right. So, Stephen, so the rest of the question says B dies intestate, right? So what happens when B dies intestate?
C gets B share
That's right. How come?
because they still have joint tenancy and survivorship applies.
Okay. So after B dies intestate, the right of survivorship kicks in. C gets B share, right? So now, sorry, my throat's a little bit dry. Samantha, what is relationship between D and C? What's their relationship now? C got B share, so B's out of the picture. What do you think the answer is? Yes. C and D are tenants in common. Right? Okay. Let's walk through this, right? B and C were joint tenants, right? B dies. Then C got all of B's share, right? But C still has D sticking around. That doesn't get rid of D. So effectively, because they were each tenants in common with D, now C is a tenant in common. Oh, C is a tenant in common with D. All right. So now what happens? It's not in the question, but I'll ask it to Shelley. What happens when D dies? I'm sorry. Let's say either one. But let's try C first, actually. What happens when C dies? What happens to the land? Anything happens. Exactly. When C dies, it goes to C's heirs. How come it doesn't go to D?
Because they're tenants in common.
Yes,
not,
exactly. That's exactly right. Right? At this point, they're only tenants in common, and C's heirs takes it. Right? Let's say that E is C's heirs. So now we have D and E as tenants in common. Everyone see that? A little tricky. but always keep track of the different relationships. And if it helps you, do what I did. Go A to B, A to C, B to C, and spell out each relationship separately. And that way you'll keep yourself in order.
Oh, I have a question because after B dies, C gets B's share. So we looked at that first relationship from D to B. Well, now it's D and C, so that there are still tenants in common. But then if you go down to the next one, B and C, that relationship's not affected. But then the next relationship, B to C, if C acquires B's share, then now there's no more joint tenants, because B's dead. So C should have B simple.
You're correct till your second to last sentence.
Okay.
Okay. So again, D has a tenancy in common, right? D has some share in the land. The mere fact that B dies doesn't get rid of D. So now.
Oh, this is all the same
Yeah.
piece of land.
Yeah. So, yeah. This is all the same.
Okay. Never mind.
Wow, is that thunder outside?
Yeah.
Everyone see this? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is all a sequence of events in a single piece of land.
D and C always had a tenancy in common
Right.
from the beginning when A sold the land to D.
But now C's share is greater because C has not only his share, but also B's share. I don't want to put a number on it, but if you were to say it, right, again, I don't want you doing this, but I'm not even going to write it. But in theory, it'd be 1/3, 2/3.
Okay.
In the event of a sale. I'm not going to write that because it's not correct. Questions? All right. All right. Carrie, you want to take a look at the second question? Question 2, please. Okay. Amanda. Yeah, want to go look at question number 2?
Sure. T divides Blackacre to A and B as joint tenants for their joint lives, the remainder to their survivor.
Okay. Yeah. So what do you think happens here? It says T divides Blackacre to A and B as joint tenants for the joint lives. This is actually the question I think Lou asked 5 minutes ago.
Like A and B are joint tenants, but it's like a life estate.
Yes. Right? You can give a joint tenancy in life estate. It doesn't have to be a joint tenancy in fee simple. Right? So what's the measurement of this life estate? How long does it last for?
The joint lives of the two.
What does that mean?
So I guess the one who survives.
Whoever lives longer.
Yeah.
Right. So this is, if you ever saw the episode of The Simpsons, of Flying Hellfish, a Tong Ting, where you give, the episode was Mr. Burns and all the soldiers found all this Nazi stolen art. And they reach a pact where it goes to whoever lives the longest, right? Whoever dies last. And the last two are Grandpa Simpson and Mr. Burns. And Mr. Burns tries to kill Grandpa Simpson. And then at the end, the Germans show up and they say, oh, that's mine. Right. But you can have a joint thing. So, all right, whoever lives longer, right, gets to keep it. So effectively what this does is it gives a life estate for A and B. And then a contingent remainder and the survivors, right? So when both of them finally die, then it goes to the survivor of A and B, right? A and B have it jointly, and then when one of them dies, it goes to the other one. No, at that point it's for fee simple. So he says remainder to the survivor. Yeah, it goes remainder to the survivor. And in the event that there's some sort, someone always asks this, what if they die in a horrible plane crash, right? And they die simultaneously. I think they mentioned this in the book somewhere. They try and prove the exact moment of death of who died first. Like, this person sitting in row 1, this person sitting in row 15, so the person in row 1 died first in a plane crash, or whatever ridiculousness that is, right? But generally speaking, they don't have concurrent deaths. Okay. Emily, you want to read question 3, please?
A and B are planning to get married. 2 weeks before the ceremony, they buy a house and take title in A and B as tenants by entirety. Several years after the marriage, A moves out of the house and conveys his interest in the house to his brother C. C brings an action to partition the property.
All right, so we have the thing, A and B are planning to be married. 2 weeks for the ceremony, they buy a house, take title, and A and B is tenants by the entirety. Okay. Then A moves out of the house. and conveys his interest to his brother C. I don't think his wife will be very happy about that, but I guess that happens, right? So then C brings an action partition, right? So we have to determine here is what was the initial tenancy given. So see, husband and wife. Emily, let's walk through our unities, right? So did A and B take it at the same time?
Yes.
Okay. Did A and B take it with the same title? We said this, they take title with one instrument, right? Did they have the same interest in the house? At least initially, did they have equal possession to the house? Okay. Marriage? Good. That's a trick. The answer is not yet. How come not yet?
Because it says 2 weeks before the ceremony.
Yeah, this is such a silly question. I don't know why they trick you with this, right? But you're not married till you're married, right? If it's before. So, but Emily, with the other 4 unities present, so how would we characterize this estate? Sorry? That's right. We have 4 of the 5 unities. That's still sufficient for a joint tenancy. So, Emily, what happens to the joint tenancy when A conveys his interest to his brother?
It's never said.
And what does it become? That's right. At this point, it becomes a tenancy in common, right? And once you have a tenancy in common, a court very well may give a partition or not. It's unclear. Okay? All right. Okay. All right. Any questions to that question? Right. So at that point, it's a tenancy in common because the interest was severed. So you should always be walking through, asking yourself, are these unities present? And if not, figure out which estate it is. Any questions on this? All right, let's do the last case. And I think I've mentioned this before. If I haven't, I will now. Whenever you see a case from California, what do you assume? No, that's weird. What are they going to do? They're going to reverse a common law rule. Okay, this is almost without fail. You know, this book, 80% of California cases reverse a common law rule. Right? You can explain. Here's this rule which has been around for 500 years. And here's why it doesn't really make sense anymore. So let's just ignore it and get rid of it. Right? That's effectively a California decision. If you are studying for the California bar, that's what you have to learn. Okay. So let's talk about this case, which is somewhat enigmatic. Riddle v. Harmon. Bad. Okay. Michael, what happened? What happened in Riddle v. Harmon? What happened in this case?
A married couple. Where there was a married couple and they had a joint tenancy.
That's
and,
right.
And the wife, when she found out, she realized like what that entailed, like on her death, like everything would go to her husband, and she wanted to avoid that. So she tried to separate, or like to transfer the interest to herself. So
Yeah.
it was
Okay, but what, in short, what was the wife trying to do here?
prevent everything from going to her
Yeah.
to go into-
Okay, so this is actually not too uncommon, right? Husband and wife get married, they're young, they're in love, they title their houses joint tenants, everything's wonderful, and they grow old, start hating each other, right? It's a classic tale of love, right? The wife realizes as she's approaching her death that, when I die, my husband will now own this house in fee simple. That's not going to happen. I want to screw him over. So the only way for her to leave this property interest to someone else is to sever her joint tenancy, right? So, Selena, what would be the normal route for the wife to take in order to sever this joint tenancy? What would be like the normal route?
She would have to transfer to somebody else.
Yes, right. So say like she wanted to leave it to her son or her daughter or whatever it is, right? She could have done that right away. Why didn't she do that? Maybe she didn't trust them, right? Also, if she was transferred to her kids right away, she wouldn't have luck. They could have thrown her out of the house. See, this is the thing about transfers up during life and after death, which you might not fully appreciate. Once you transfer your interest to your in-grade kids, you're screwed. You got nothing, right? Right. Arib, what could the mom have done if she didn't really trust her kid? Well, she thought her in-grade kid would throw her out in the curb when she's old and dying.
Strong man?
Before we get to the strong, what could she have done more simply? Think of what we did in the last topic.
Just pay it to a separate state as a gift.
No, what could she have done to make sure she had it for the rest of her life? Think about it.
You can't give it yourself.
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Well, how? Think about it. How could she have done this to make sure her kid won't throw her out in the curb while she's alive? Yes. Think about it. So what the mom could have done, which would probably been smarter, is given herself a life estate and then give the remainder to her kid, right? That would ensure that she can have it as long as she's alive, and when she dies, the interest then descends to the kid. And by doing this, she just severed the unities because now there's another title, there's another instrument, right? She did none of the above, right? So then Arib mentioned, Lou, what exactly is this straw man business? What does that mean? How
You sell it to somebody, he will sell it right back to you.
Yeah, effectively. This is a straw man purchase. You often hear this topic with straw gun buys, right? So she could have effectively sold her interest to her lawyer's friend or whatever it is, right? And the lawyer's friend could have sold it right back to her immediately. And the sole purpose of this conveyance was to sever the unities, was to eliminate the unity and make it into a tenancy in common, right? So she had 3 possible options. She did none of the above, right? Now, before you get far, her lawyer should, at the time, her lawyer should have been liable for malpractice, right? He gave this woman really bad legal advice that only by the saving grace of California courts did she survive. Because under the law as it existed then, there were 3 possible ways for her to sever this unity, right? Transfer it outright, keep a life estate for herself, use a straw. Instead, they chose door number 4. Floor? Rhymes. Yeah, what's door number 4?
Give it to herself.
How? Directly to herself, right? She transferred it directly to herself. She gave herself her own interest. Floor, conceptually, what does that mean to give yourself your own interest? What's that even mean?
I'm not sure.
Well, what did that in theory have these effects, right? Yourself and
Did it sever the relationship because the time man did?
Yes, exactly right. By giving yourself a new instrument, you've just severed time and title, right? You've just severed the 2 T's. You give yourself a new title. And in theory, that would break the unities and make it a tenancy common. But was that allowed under California law, Matthew, at the time when they did this?
No.
Why not? What did California law say at the time?
They use a straw man?
Yeah. So under California law at the time, you were not allowed to sever the unities. Excuse me. You were not allowed to sever the unities by doing this transfer to yourself. See, Alex, could you create a joint tenancy without using straw man?
Without using?
Yeah.
No.
You could.
Well,
No, could you create a joint tenancy?
yeah.
Yes. So think about it. Originally, at early common law, the only way to create a joint tenancy was to do it with a straw man. The person who owns it fee simple would transfer it to a straw man. The straw man would transfer it back with a joint tenant. California eliminated that and they said, you don't need to, right? If I own Blackacre and fee simple, I can transfer it to myself and Alex, and we can both be joint tenants together, right? So what the court effectively said here is, this doesn't make sense. How is it possible that you can create a joint tenancy without a straw man, but you need a stupid straw man in order to eliminate it, right? So Nick, what did the court hold here?
They decided that you don't need a straw man.
How come?
Because it seems, that's like an ancient.
Yeah, they go back to liver sizing, right? They say, remember that thing I showed you? You put the clump of dirt in the hand and then the twiggle, right? They say, of course you can't twiggle yourself. Never mind. So of course you can't give yourself a clump of dirt, right? it would make sense to give yourself sizing, right? But here we're not dealing with such feudalistic, antiquity, so we're going to ignore that rule. And as I said, whenever you have any kind of California case, they're about to dump a common law rule. You can take that to the bank, even if you don't even, you're in a different class with contracts or torts or whatever, and you have a case from California. Just assume they're about to dump a common law rule. It's pretty reliable. Okay. All right. So here they basically abolished this rule. All right. Any questions in this case? All right. My throat is hurting because I have a sore throat, so I will stop here, and I'll see all of you on Wednesday.